I could express that best with the statement made to me by a newsman from a Chicago newspaper whom I had met outside during the smoking period, and his remark as the judges came out for rendering a decision. And my friend of the Chicago Press turned around and whispered to me, he said, look at their faces, guilty as hell.
Guilty as hell. That's what the Army called Lieutenant Colonel Harry Fleming after it court-martialed him for collaboration with the enemy as a prisoner of the North Koreans. Fleming came home to a hero's welcome in Racine, Wisconsin in the fall of 1953. By the summer of '54, he was in solitary confinement at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, later to be stripped of his rank and privileges, honor, and dignity.
I was furious when I saw my friend in the condition that he'd been put in for 90 days, and when I saw what had occurred to him. And to see this man reduced to the whipped dog that he was that day that I went down and found him in solitary confinement, I was angered, of course, and I never lost that all through the trial.
Harry Fleming came to Racine in the summer of 1948. He was a major in the U.S. Army who acted as advisor to the local Reserve Army units in Racine. Then the Army cut orders for Harry and sent him to help the Allies in Korea. Within 3 months, Harry found himself held captive by the North Koreans. He was a POW for 3.5 torturous years.
We had a young man in the camp under the North Koreans that was very badly wounded. He had a leg that was practically shot off, and no medical attention at all, and gangrene had set in. And the doctor said, if his leg isn't amputated, why, he's going to die. So I went to camp commander and told him that they should get a doctor in there and amputate this boy's leg, that the American doctor said so. And finally he said, no, they couldn't do anything like that. I said, well, if you'll furnish us with the necessary things that are needed for an amputation, my doctor will do it, the American doctor will do it. He said, okay, we'll do that. So he gave us a butcher knife and a thing that looked like a hacksaw and some kind of a medicine that put the man partially unconscious. And the doctor amputated the leg. The man lived, and the man had all the courage that any man ever had. They decided they'd move the camp. It was still snow on the ground. And this boy just couldn't make it. And he lagged behind, and one of the guards killed him. They put me in the hole, and it was about 6 feet deep, and not wide enough or long enough to stretch out in. You could sit down with your chin up under your knees. And I was there for several days, I don't know how long. And as I say, it was in a place where they had, the guard company was there. And I guess they thought it was just a lark, that they'd use the hole that I was in as a latrine, and they did for several days. I don't remember coming out of it. I was unconscious when I came out.
When Harry returned to Racine in 1953, he was a physical wreck, but his spirits were high. He and 3 other POWs from Racine were given a royal welcome, treated to a parade, and on their way to the memories of most people's minds. But then something happened that made Harry Fleming a national figure. The Army brought charges against him for collaboration with the enemy as a prisoner of war.
When I heard that, I went down to Fort Sheridan and had great difficulty getting to see him. And when I finally saw him, I could hardly believe what had happened to him in the time that he had been held at Fort Sheridan. Now, he'd been a prisoner of the Koreans and the Chinese for over 3 years, and they had never really broken his spirit. But the 90 days or so that he had been held by his own government had really broken the man, and he was whipped, and he was willing to do whatever the Army was going to do to him.
And I saw a man withered to something around 100 pounds with a post-Korean prisoner look. He certainly was on the rocks. His counsel was there, and I was told that he was the property of the government, and the public were to be excluded from anything that would happen in a public way until the trial, which was going to be 3 days later. there wasn't much that could be said outside of watching a prisoner lay in bed and withering and crying for help.
Harry got into trouble because of some propaganda broadcasts he made for the North Koreans during his first 18 months of captivity.
The camp commander, the Korean camp commander, took me one time about a mile from where we were to over to the caves. And there were about 13 or 14 prisoners, American prisoners in there that were from the 7th Division. And they were living in this cave that was wet, mud, water dripping on them. They were soaking wet and had been there for days. And he let me talk to them. And then they took me away. The deal I made was that they would get those men out of the caves if I would make a broadcast. And I wouldn't do it. And every day he'd take me back to the same men. And where there were 14 yesterday, there'd be maybe 12 today. And I still wouldn't make the broadcast. And he'd bring me back again. Finally, when it got down, there were, what, 4?
I think it was 6 at the
6
time.
left.
Yeah.
I finally made the broadcast. The rest of them just died. They took them out. Yeah, 6. And they put these 6 in my compound where I was a senior officer. And every one of them at my court-martial were witnesses for the defense.
I think that the Army was overreacting to this unknown factor known as brainwashing. To me, that was the attitude that I saw and the way they approached this case. It seemed from beginning to end they were going to make an example of Harry. The charges were very weak. Some of them were ludicrous. The first charge that they brought, I thought, would set the tenor of the entire trial. He was charged with stamping on the foot of a corporal when they were first loaded on the trucks when they'd been captured. The Army brought the corporal in. He was sworn in. He testified. He didn't remember anything about it.
I remember on one occasion they stripped Fleming to the waist and showed his wounds to those who were gathered. And about the only noise you could hear was the clicking of the needles as the wives of officers who were permitted to go to the trial, as was the public, knitting as they thought, well, there, but for the grace of God, is Joe.
I felt the Army was under terrible pressure, if you'll remember, at that time. McCarthy was alleging so many things against the Army, trying to show that they were weak on communism. And I didn't realize that at the time, but as I look back years ago, it was obvious to me that the Army had to react some way to this situation. And what they did was, I felt at that time, was pick somebody to prove that they were hard on their own.
Harry Fleming was found guilty on September 22, 1954. He was sentenced to be stripped of rank and privileges and dismissed from the Army.
Well, the entire attitude of the court, their questions, the manner in which the prosecution was presented, everything about the court-martial indicated that we were all going through the motions and that Colonel Fleming was going to get it, and he did.
The attitude of a court-martial is that the man would not be brought to trial if he were not guilty. That was always my attitude when I sat on a court. And I could see that reaction among the officers who were sitting in judgment.
I look back and I think, well, it'd be nice if such a thing hadn't have happened. But it has happened, and I've got to face it. So we'll go on from there.
We had a good life. We never sat around and felt sorry for ourselves one bit. We were too busy and too occupied to do that. I don't think it's made us bitter. I don't think it's made too much difference in our lives. I think that the thing I felt most of all was that his lack of medical benefits, because he had many things all through these years, various, I guess about 5 or 6 serious operations, which could be traced back to the difficulties that he had under as a POW, that were the basic causes of these troubles. And that to me has always been rankled more than anything else, the fact that these were caused by that POW time, yet we got no compensation for it, and we were busy earning a living. It wasn't hard to start all over at 50 years of age and earn a living. And then we had to pay all these medical expenses ourselves with no help. And while it didn't make me bitter, it certainly made me feel that it was very unjust treatment.
People forgot about Harry Fleming, but then a new movement to help him began in the 1970s.
President Carter's attitude towards clemency was a big factor, I think, that got everybody thinking who was interested in Fleming. It actually started out with Ralph Trower, the newspaper man, a columnist in Racine.
We were around when the Harry Fleming trial took place in 1954, and at the time Lyle and I talked, President Carter seemed to be pardoning everybody in sight, those who had gone to Canada as deserters and people who had been let out of the Army for various reasons. And so we got to wondering, all these years there had been nothing out of Fleming. We wondered, would he make another try? So I said, well, I will call him and see.
Trower kept writing columns calling for clemency for Harry Fleming. People in Racine kept after the Army and the government with petitions. Congressman Les Aspin took an interest, and Alan Gramza, now a federal judge, filed new briefs. In September 1978, the renewed efforts paid off. The Army Review Board ruled Harry Fleming should be given an honorable discharge from the Army and his rank and privileges restored.
I think I can speak for most of the people in Racine in saying it makes us feel very good. It broke my personal losing streak at 134 causes I supported, which went nowhere. I've had a lot of reaction from people, some of whom remember Harry and some of whom don't. That justice finally has been done.
And the Flemings? They have a love affair for the people of Racine.
We're both deeply grateful for all that they did, and we're just waiting for the opportunity to visit Racine and meet them face to face, just as many of them as we can, so that we can thank them for being the kind of people they are.
First of all, we love them all. And from the things that they have done for me over the many, many years that this has been going on, I'll forever have my heart full of gratitude to them. I could name maybe 1,000 names of people that have really worked for me. And I thank them all. And I hope that in the few months ahead that we'll be able to get up there and talk with them and get together with them. I would live in Racine. I'd go back there and live if I could. The doctors tell me I need a warm climate, and that's the only reason I'm not back there. It's a wonderful city. It's a wonderful community. And unfortunately, I have to live down here. It's really something.